Imagine this. You are in a small, windowless chamber, carved out of the earth beneath a simple wattle and daub cottage. The air is thick and damp, carrying the faint, cloying scent of dried herbs mixed with something else, something metallic and strangely animalistic. A single tallow candle, its flame sputtering nervously, casts long, dancing shadows that make the rough-hewn walls seem to writhe. You are kneeling on cold, packed earth, your breath catching in your throat, heart thrumming a frantic rhythm against your ribs. Before you, a woman, her face etched with a desperate, almost feverish resolve, chants in a low, guttural murmur, words that sound like no prayer you have ever heard. Her hands, gnarled and calloused from years of toil, clench around a small, crudely fashioned figure made of straw and dried mud. It is unmistakably human in form, yet grotesque, with exaggerated features that seem to mock the very idea of life. As her chant reaches a crescendo, she dips the figure into a shallow bowl filled with a dark, viscous liquid. Then, with a sharp, almost violent movement, pricks her own finger with a sliver of bone, letting a single crimson drop fall onto the effigy's belly. The flickering light catches the sheen of tears in her wide, fearful eyes. Tears born not of sorrow, but of a profound, bone-deep terror and an equally profound, desperate hope. You feel a chill seep into your bones, a dread that has nothing to do with the dampness of the earth. What unholy bargain is being struck in this hidden, suffocating space? What torment has driven this woman to such a secret, forbidden act, an act that surely courts damnation in a world steeped in the fear of God? We pull back from that unsettling tableau, from the flickering shadows and the desperate, hushed prayers. What, we must ask ourselves, could twist the most fundamental and intimate aspects of human existence, love, desire, procreation, into such strange and often terrifying forms? How did the very act of seeking connection, of yearning for family, become so entangled with fear, superstition, and practices that, to our modern sensibilities, seem utterly bizarre? To understand this, we must first step into the very fabric of the medieval world, a world utterly alien in its certainties and its terrors, yet profoundly human in its underlying desires. Let us meet Alara, the woman we glimpsed in that secret chamber, a woman whose journey embodies the struggles of her age. She lived in a small, unassuming village nestled deep within the rolling hills of Wessex in the year of our Lord 1340. Her days were a rhythm of dawn to dusk labor, punctuated by the tolling of the church bell that dictated the cycles of prayer and rest. Her hands, though young, were already toughened by the loom and the hoe, her shoulders accustomed to the weight of water buckets and bundles of firewood. Alara was not born into wealth or privilege. Her life was one of simple, earthy realities. Yet she possessed a quiet strength, a deep well of resilience beneath a gentle demeanor. Her eyes, the color of moss after a spring rain, held a thoughtful, observant quality, rarely missing the subtle shifts in the village's mood or the unspoken anxieties of her neighbors. She was married to Gareth, a man whose hands were as strong and true as his heart. Gareth was a carpenter, his days filled with the scent of freshly cut oak and the rhythmic thud of his hammer. He was a man of few words, but his devotion to Alara was evident in the careful way he mended their roof each spring, in the warmth of the fire he kept burning on cold nights, and in the unspoken tenderness that passed between them in the quiet intimacy of their small cottage. Their love was not the grand, courtly romance sung by troubadours, but a sturdy, practical affection, rooted in shared labor, mutual respect, and a deep-seated hope for a future together. They had been wed for 5 years, a relatively long time in a world where life was often brutally short, and marriages frequently cut short by plague or famine. And in those 5 years, they had prayed, they had hoped, they had waited, but no child had yet blessed their union. This absence, this quiet, persistent emptiness, was a shadow that lengthened with each passing season. In a society where a woman's worth was so often measured by the fruit of her womb, Ilara felt the weight of unspoken judgment pressing down upon her. The sympathetic glances from the older women, the hushed whispers she sometimes overheard, the subtle, almost imperceptible distance that grew between her and the mothers of the village. All these small things accumulated, eroding her confidence, planting seeds of doubt and shame in her heart. Gareth, though he never voiced a complaint, carried his own burden of disappointment, a quiet ache that manifested in the way he sometimes stared into the flickering fire, his brow furrowed in thought. Their shared desire for a child was not merely a personal longing. It was a societal imperative, a spiritual duty, and its unfulfillment was a source of profound, growing anxiety for them both. They were good, devout people, regular in their attendance at Mass, diligent in their prayers, generous with their meager harvest to those less fortunate. They lived their lives according to the dictates of the Holy Mother Church, believing firmly in divine providence and the righteousness of their faith. But as the years without a child stretched onward, a desperate question began to form in Ilara's mind, a question too terrifying to voice aloud. Had God forsaken them? Or, worse yet, was there some hidden sin, some unknown transgression that condemned them to barrenness? The medieval world in which Ilara and Gareth lived was a landscape profoundly shaped by faith. The church was not merely an institution, it was the very bedrock of existence, an omnipresent force that guided every aspect of life, from birth to death. Its doctrines permeated the air. People breathed, the food they ate, the thoughts they dared to think. For the common folk, whose lives were often brutal and short, the promise of eternal salvation was a beacon of hope in a world effete with suffering. But this hope came with a heavy price, the ever-present fear of eternal damnation. Every action, every thought, every secret desire was scrutinized through the lens of sin and redemption. And nowhere was this scrutiny more intense, more fraught with peril, than in the realm of human sexuality. Sex, in the eyes of the medieval church, was a necessary evil, tolerated primarily for the sacred purpose of procreation within the confines of holy matrimony. Any act of intimacy that did not explicitly aim at creating new life was viewed with suspicion, often condemned as a venial or even mortal sin. Pleasure, for pleasure's sake, was a dangerous indulgence, a temptation of the flesh that could lead one down the path to perdition. The marriage bed, while blessed for its procreative potential, was also a battleground where the forces of piety and carnal desire constantly clashed. Confessors, with their detailed penitential manuals, meticulously categorized and condemned a vast array of sexual acts. The very concept of sodomy was expanded far beyond its modern definition, encompassing not just same-sex relations, but any heterosexual act deemed unnatural or non-procreative. This included oral sex, anal sex, masturbation, and even certain positions during intercourse if they were perceived to hinder conception or were engaged in solely for pleasure. The psychological burden this placed on ordinary men and women was immense. How could they reconcile the powerful, undeniable urges of their own bodies, the natural human yearning for intimacy and pleasure, with the constant threat of eternal fire? This tension, this profound, almost unbearable psychological rift between rigid moral codes and inherent human nature, became the fertile ground from which a bewildering array of secret, often bizarre, practices would sprout. This was the why, the desperate search for solace, for control, for pleasure, or for meaning within a suffocating moral framework that simultaneously sanctified and condemned the most fundamental human drive. The village priest, Father Michael, was a man of stern countenance and unwavering faith. His sermons, delivered from the simple wooden pulpit, were often vivid warnings against the temptations of the flesh. He spoke of demons lurking in the shadows, of the fires of hell awaiting the unrepentant sinner, of the devil's cunning in whispering illicit desires into the hearts of the devout. His words, though meant to guide and protect, also instilled a profound fear that permeated every aspect of daily life. Parishioners would confess their most intimate transgressions, sometimes in excruciating detail, seeking absolution and guidance. Father Michael would then consult his worn, leather-bound, penitential book, a text filled with lists of sins and their corresponding penances. Fasting, flagellation, lengthy prayers, pilgrimages, or even public humiliation. The fear of being found out, of having one's secret sins exposed, was a constant companion, a heavy cloak worn by many. Yet, despite the omnipresence of the Church and its doctrines, another, older belief system thrived in the medieval countryside. A deep-seated undercurrent of folk magic, superstition, and ancient pagan practices that had never been fully eradicated by the arrival of Christianity. These beliefs were not openly flaunted, but whispered in darkened corners, passed down through generations of women, and invoked in times of desperate need. When the Church's prayers failed to bring rain, the villagers might turn to an old woman who knew a charm for the clouds. When a child fell ill, alongside the priest's blessing, a mother might hang an amulet of dried herbs around its neck. And when it came to matters of love, desire, and fertility, the lines between Christian piety and ancient superstition blurred almost entirely. This was the world Alara inhabited, a world where the sacred and the profane, the divine and the demonic, were not distant concepts but intimately intertwined realities, shaping the very landscape of her emotional and spiritual life. The barrenness of her womb was not just a physical ailment. It was a spiritual crisis, a profound challenge to her faith and her place in the community. And as the weight of this burden grew heavier, her gaze, once solely fixed on the altar, began to drift towards the shadows, towards the whispered remedies and forbidden knowledge that promised what prayer alone had not yet delivered. As the 5th year of their marriage drew to a close, the quiet despair in Alara's heart began to morph into something more urgent, more desperate. Her silent prayers felt hollow. Her pilgrimages to the local shrine seemed to yield only deeper exhaustion. The village, once a source of comfort, now felt like a cage of judging eyes. The women who once shared stories of their children's antics now offered only strained smiles and averted gazes when Alara approached. She imagined their thoughts, their silent pity, perhaps even a hint of suspicion. Was she somehow cursed? Was there a flaw in her, a hidden sin that made her unworthy of motherhood? Gareth, too, grew more withdrawn, his usual quietness deepening into a heavy silence. He worked longer hours, as if physical exhaustion could somehow banish the unspoken grief that settled between them each night. Their intimacy, once a source of comfort and hopeful anticipation, became tinged with a quiet desperation. Each act of union a silent plea to a seemingly indifferent heaven. The pressure mounted, not just from within, but from without, an invisible force pushing Alara towards a precipice she never imagined she would approach. It was in this state of profound vulnerability that Alara finally sought out the village's wise woman, a reclusive figure named Old Morwen. Morwen lived on the fringes of the community, her small, crooked cottage nestled deep in the woods, far from the church bell's reach. She was a woman of ancient knowledge, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes sharp and knowing. The villagers respected her, feared her, and, in their secret hearts, often sought her out when conventional remedies failed. Alara had always avoided Morwen, conditioned by Father Michael's warnings against practitioners of dark arts. But desperation, as it often does, had eroded her pious resolve. One moonless night, under the cover of a thick, swirling mist, Alara made her way through the whispering woods to Morwen's cottage. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and unseen life, and every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made her heart leap. She knocked on the gnarled wooden door, her knuckles trembling. Morwen answered, her eyes, like black coals, piercing Alara's soul. Without a word, she led Alara into her cottage, a room filled with strange odors, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the earthy smell of roots, the pungent aroma of smoke from a constantly smoldering fire. Alara explained her plight, her voice barely a whisper, the words of barrenness and emptiness tasting bitter on her tongue. Morwen listened, her face impassive, occasionally nodding. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, child," Morwen finally rasped, her voice like dry leaves skittering across stone. "But sometimes, the Lord needs a little help from the old ways." And here is where the story takes a truly bizarre turn, revealing the desperate measures some took to defy fate, or perhaps simply to survive the crushing expectations of their world. Morwen did not offer prayers or pilgrimages. Instead, she spoke of ancient forces, of the earth's own fertility, of sympathetic magic. Her remedies were not for the faint of heart, nor for the strictly pious. She instructed Alara in a series of rituals, each one more unsettling than the last. The first involved gathering specific herbs under a full moon, grinding them into a paste, and then applying them to her own body, particularly to her belly and breasts, before Gareth came to her bed. The concoction smelled musky and strange, and its touch on her skin felt both alien and oddly potent. She was to repeat this for 7 nights, each time whispering an invocation to the forgotten spirits of the forest, rather than to the Virgin Mary. The act felt profoundly transgressive, a betrayal of everything Father Michael preached, yet the desperate hope it offered was a powerful intoxicant. But this was only the beginning of the strange path Alara would walk. Morwen's next instruction involved the creation of a fertility fetish, the very figure we glimpsed in the opening. It was to be fashioned from the earth of a freshly plowed field, mixed with straw from a fertile harvest, and shaped in the likeness of a pregnant woman, but with exaggerated features that gave it a grotesque, almost pagan aspect. Alara was to place this figure beneath her bed, and on specific nights, she was to perform a ritual. This ritual, Morwen explained, was to infuse the effigy with her own life force and desire. And here is where the practice truly delved into the realm of the profoundly unsettling. Alara was instructed that, During her most intimate moments with Gareth, she was to focus her intention not just on her husband, but on the small, crude figure hidden beneath their bed, imagining her own life flowing into it, willing it to mimic the act of conception. And then, at the climax of their union, she was to touch the effigy, letting her hand linger, believing the energy of their act would transfer to the charm. This was not merely prayer. It was an attempt to harness ancient, primal forces to trick fate itself. The thought of it filled Alara with a mixture of revulsion and a powerful, almost intoxicating sense of forbidden power. How could something so explicitly sexual, so intimately tied to her body, be both a sacred act of marriage and a desperate, secret ritual of pagan influence? The psychological tension was immense, tearing at her soul. The Church, in its tireless efforts to regulate human behavior, also sought to control the act of conception, though from a diametrically opposed perspective. While Alara was desperately seeking to conceive, many others, particularly those burdened by poverty or the sheer impossibility of feeding more mouths, sought to avoid it. Yet any form of contraception was fiercely condemned as a grave sin, often lumped in with abortion and infanticide. This created another layer of bizarre practices, born out of a desperate need for control over one's own body and future. People, despite the Church's strictures, attempted various methods, often rooted in superstition and misinformation. Some women might wear specific amulets during intercourse, believing they would ward off conception. Others might consume strange concoctions of herbs, hoping they would render them barren. There were whispers of women who would insert pessaries made of various plants or animal parts, hoping to block the passage of seed. Most of these methods were not only ineffective, but often dangerous, leading to illness or even death. But the desperation was real, the stakes incredibly high, and the willingness to defy both nature and divine law when faced with an impossible future was a powerful motivator. One of the most common and most condemned forms of contraception was coitus interruptus, the withdrawal method. While seemingly simple, in the eyes of the Church, this was a profound sin against nature, a deliberate act of spilling seed and thwarting God's will. It was considered a form of sodomy because it prevented the natural purpose of intercourse, procreation. Confessors would grill parishioners on this, and the penances were severe. Imagine the internal conflict. A husband and wife, perhaps already struggling to feed their existing children, grappling with the fear of another mouth to feed, yet terrified of the damnation that awaited them if they sought to avoid conception. This fear, this agonizing choice between earthly survival and eternal salvation, pushed many to clandestine acts and secret penances, living lives riddled with guilt and anxiety. But the Church's reach extended far beyond simple confession. It sought to control the very essence of human desire, sometimes with chillingly precise and, frankly, bizarre directives. The penitential manuals, those detailed ledgers of sin and punishment, revealed a world obsessed with sexual transgression. Acts that today would be considered part of normal marital intimacy were then categorized as mortal sins requiring harsh penance. For instance, engaging in intercourse during holy seasons like Lent or Advent, or on Sundays and feast days, was forbidden. The idea was to keep the mind focused on God, not on carnal pleasures. But human nature, as always, proved difficult to entirely suppress. Imagine a young couple, filled with natural desire, having to navigate a calendar filled with forbidden nights, constantly fearing they might inadvertently transgress and incur God's wrath. This created an atmosphere of pervasive guilt, where even the most natural expressions of love were shadowed by the threat of sin. Furthermore, these manuals delved into the specifics of marital intercourse, dictating not just when, but how a couple should engage. Any position other than the so-called missionary position, man on top, woman on bottom, facing each other, was often condemned as unnatural or beastly, again because it was thought to hinder procreation, or simply because it was considered a deviation from the divinely ordained order. Oral sex, anal sex, or any other form of intimacy not directly aimed at conception were considered forms of sodomy and were met with severe penances. The records of confessions reveal people agonizing over these minute details, terrified they had committed some unknown sin in the privacy of their own beds. This meticulous cataloging of sexual sins created a climate of fear and self-surveillance, where individuals were constantly examining their own desires and actions, scrutinizing their most intimate moments for any hint of transgression. The psychological impact of such detailed, pervasive moral policing was profound, fostering a deep-seated shame around sexuality itself. Imagine the terror, the sheer psychological torment of believing your most intimate moments could be invaded by unseen, malevolent forces. In the medieval mind, the world was not just populated by humans and animals, it was teeming with spirits, both benevolent and malevolent. Demons were not abstract concepts. They were real, tangible entities, constantly seeking to corrupt and torment humanity. And among the most insidious of these demonic entities were the incubus and the succubus. The incubus, a male demon, was believed to lie upon women in their sleep, having sexual intercourse with them. The succubus, its female counterpart, would lie with men. These encounters were not merely nightmares. They were often seen as actual physical events, capable of causing real-world consequences, including unwanted pregnancies, in the case of the incubus, or the draining of a man's vital life force. The belief in incubi and succubi was pervasive and deeply unsettling. It offered an explanation for many phenomena that were otherwise incomprehensible. Nocturnal emissions. The feeling of being watched in the dead of night, or even the unexplained exhaustion that might plague a person after a restless sleep. These entities were not merely figments of a fevered imagination. They were incorporated into theological texts, examined by learned scholars, and discussed in hushed tones by terrified villagers. The Church, while condemning the belief in and communication with such demons, paradoxically acknowledged their existence as instruments of the devil, sent to tempt and corrupt the faithful. For a woman like Alara, struggling with barrenness, the fear of an incubus could take on an especially cruel dimension. Was her inability to conceive a punishment, or perhaps the result of an unholy union forced upon her in the darkness, draining her fertility, leaving her empty for her husband? The thought, once whispered by a fearful neighbor, could become a tormenting obsession. People would sleep with crucifixes clutched in their hands, with sprigs of blessed rosemary under their pillows, or with protective charms carved into the bedposts, desperate to ward off these unseen assailants. Some would even resort to more extreme measures, like sleeping fully clothed, or drawing circles of salt around their beds, believing that such barriers could keep the demonic at bay. The very act of sleep, meant to be a time of rest and vulnerability, became another arena for spiritual warfare, where the soul was deemed most susceptible to the devil's machinations. This constant dread, this pervasive sense that one's most private moments were under scrutiny, not just by God, but by a host of unseen malevolent entities, added another layer of profound psychological burden to medieval life, especially concerning anything related to the body and its desires. As Ilara continued with Morwen's rituals, a strange transformation began to take hold within her. The initial revulsion she felt towards the crude fertility effigy and the whispered pagan invocations slowly gave way to a potent, almost addictive sense of control. Each night, as the moon waxed and waned, she would perform the prescribed rites, meticulously grinding herbs, anointing herself with their pungent oils, and, most unsettlingly, focusing her deepest desires onto the straw and mud figure beneath her bed. The act of touching the cold, rough effigy at the peak of her intimacy with Gareth felt like a profound betrayal, a secret kept not just from her husband, but from her very soul. Yet the desperate hope it ignited burned brighter than any guilt. She was no longer a passive recipient of fate. She was an active participant, attempting to twist the threads of destiny with her own hands, however forbidden those hands might be. Her internal world became a battleground. By day, she would go to Mass, kneel before the altar, and pray with an intensity born of both genuine piety and a desperate plea for forgiveness for her nightly transgressions. She would confess her impure thoughts to Father Michael, carefully omitting the true nature of her secret rituals, her heart hammering in her chest, convinced that God could see through her deception. The priest, accustomed to the vague confessions of the common folk, would offer standard penances, unaware of the profound spiritual tightrope Ilara walked. By night, however, in the hushed darkness of her cottage, the ancient, earthy magic of Morwen's teachings took hold. She felt a connection to something primal, something older than the church, a raw power that promised to fulfill her most fervent desire. This duality, this constant shifting between sacred and profane, was a torment. Yet it was also, paradoxically, a source of strange strength. She was doing what she believed was necessary, whatever the cost to her immortal soul. Gareth, observant in his quiet way, began to notice subtle changes in Ilara. She was often withdrawn, her eyes holding a distant, almost haunted quality. Sometimes, in the quiet intimacy of their bed, he would sense a tension in her, a subtle rigidity that had not been there before. He might catch the faint, unfamiliar scent of strange herbs clinging to her skin, a scent he couldn't quite place, but which struck him as odd. He would ask her, gently, if something was amiss, if her prayers were troubled, or if the burden of their childlessness weighed too heavily. Ilara would offer vague assurances, a strained smile, a quick change of subject. She could not bring herself to tell him. How could she confess to such a profound transgression, to inviting forbidden forces into their marriage bed, into the very heart of their shared hope? She feared his condemnation, his revulsion, but most of all, she feared losing his love, the one steady anchor in her increasingly turbulent world. The secret became a wedge, silently, imperceptibly, pushing a small distance between them. Their hands would still meet across the rough wooden table. Their eyes would still share moments of understanding. But a new, unspoken barrier had risen, built from fear and desperation. The medieval obsession with fertility and procreation did not end with personal rituals. It extended into the very fabric of society, manifesting in collective practices that now seem almost unfathomable. One such practice involved the use of relics, the bones, hair, or personal effects of saints. While generally revered for their spiritual power in healing or intercession, certain relics were believed to possess particular efficacy in matters of fertility. Women, desperate for a child, would undertake arduous pilgrimages to shrines housing the relics of saints known to intercede for barrenness. There, they would not merely pray. They would sometimes perform rituals that blurred the line between devotion and folk magic. They might press their bodies against the reliquary, rub cloths over it to absorb its power, or even, in more extreme cases, drink water that had been poured over the relic, hoping to ingest its miraculous essence. This was not always officially sanctioned by the Church, but it was tolerated as an expression of fervent faith, even if the practices themselves bordered on the superstitious. The belief was that the saint, having lived a life of exceptional piety, could, even in death, influence the natural order, granting the gift of life where nature had failed. This was another example of the psychological genesis of bizarre practices. The desperate desire for a child, coupled with a belief in supernatural intervention, leading to acts that seemed strange to modern eyes, but were deeply meaningful in their context. But there was a terrifying detail they had all overlooked, a darker side to the pursuit of fertility that went beyond mere superstition. In some regions, particularly those still clinging to older, pre-Christian beliefs, the desperation for children could lead to rituals involving animals, or even, in rare and horrifying instances, human sacrifice. While widely condemned by the Church and fiercely suppressed, whispers of such practices persisted in the darkest corners of the medieval world, especially during times of famine or plague, when the very survival of the community seemed to hang in the balance. These were not public rituals, but clandestine acts performed in secret, driven by a primal fear of extinction and a desperate plea to ancient forgotten gods for the continuation of life. The psychological burden of such choices, the profound moral transgression, would have been immense, driving those who participated to the very brink of madness, haunted by their actions even as they hoped for their desired outcome. Consider the role of the love potion, a staple of medieval folklore, and often a tragic reality. In a world where marriages were often arranged for economic or social reasons, where true affection was a luxury, and where the constraints of social hierarchy made romantic fulfillment difficult, people often turned to magic to ignite or secure love. These potions were not harmless concoctions of herbs and sweet words. The ingredients could be truly grotesque: powdered human bone, menstrual blood, animal parts, grave dirt, or even the consecrated host from the Mass, all mixed with various herbs and incantations. The belief was that by ingesting or being exposed to these ingredients, the target of the spell would be compelled to love the caster. Ilara had heard stories of such potions from the village gossips, whispered tales of young women who tried to ensnare a reluctant suitor, or jealous wives who sought to secure their husband's wandering affections. She had always dismissed them as foolish superstitions, the idle talk of women with too much time on their hands. But as her own desperation grew, and as the subtle distance between her and Gareth widened, a new, terrifying possibility began to worm its way into her mind. What if Gareth's quietness, his subtle withdrawal, was a sign of his diminishing affection? What if his love, once so steadfast, was beginning to wane under the relentless pressure of their childless state? The thought was like a poisoned arrow, striking at the very core of her being. One cold, biting morning, after a night of restless sleep, where her dreams were filled with the image of the crude effigy mocking her, Ilara found herself once again at Morwen's cottage. The wise woman's eyes, as sharp as ever, seemed to read the turmoil in Ilara's soul. "The child, it has not come," Ilara choked out, her voice raw with suppressed tears. "And Gareth, He grows distant. I feel it, Morwen. He is slipping away. Morwen listened, her gnarled fingers idly stroking a black cat that purred contentedly by the fire. Love, child, is a fickle beast, she rasped. Easily lost, difficult to reclaim. But there are ways to bind a man's heart, to ensure his devotion. And here is where the story takes a truly dark turn, revealing the lengths to which human beings would go, not just for a child, but for the preservation of love, or what they perceived as love, in a world where emotional security was as fragile as life itself. Morwen spoke of a love charm, not a potion to ignite new love, but one to reignite and secure existing affection, to bind Gareth's heart inextricably to Ilara's. The ingredients were even more disturbing than those for the fertility effigy. Morwen instructed Ilara to gather a lock of Gareth's hair, a piece of his clothing that had been worn close to his skin, and, most chillingly, a drop of his blood, to be obtained subtly, without his knowledge. These, combined with specific herbs gathered under the new moon, were to be woven into a small, intricate knot, then placed beneath Gareth's pillow as he slept. The ritual was meant to weave their destinies together, to fortify the bonds of their marriage against the erosive forces of disappointment and time. Ilara recoiled at the suggestion of taking Gareth's blood. The idea of violating his body, even in such a small way, without his consent, felt profoundly wrong. A step too far into the forbidden. It crossed a line that even her desperate desire for a child had not yet dared to breach. But Morwen's words, spoken with a quiet certainty, began to chip away at her resistance. He will never know, child. And if it binds his heart to yours, if it brings joy and the fruit of your womb, is it not a small price to pay? Is his love not worth this small secrecy? The wise woman's logic, twisted as it was, preyed on Ilara's deepest fears and vulnerabilities. The thought of losing Gareth, of facing a future alone and barren, was a specter more terrifying than any demon Father Michael preached about. The psychological genesis of such practices lies in the profound powerlessness many medieval individuals felt over their own lives. Faced with rampant disease, unpredictable harvests, and the absolute authority of the church and their feudal lords, people sought any means to exert control, however small, over their destinies. Love, fertility, and even death were often seen as outside human influence, dictated by God or fate. Magic, however, offered a glimmer of agency, a secret pathway to bend these forces to one's will. This explains why so many forms of folk magic, particularly those related to the intimate spheres of life, persisted despite fierce condemnation. They represented a desperate human attempt to reclaim a semblance of control in a world that offered very little. The concept of sexual healing, or magical remedies for physical ailments, also took on bizarre forms. In a time before modern medicine, when understanding of the human body was rudimentary, and diseases often seemed to strike without warning or reason, people attributed illness to spiritual causes, demonic influence, or imbalances in the body's humors. When it came to sexual health, or indeed any form of illness, the remedies could be shockingly crude and often involved elements of sympathetic magic, or what we would now consider sheer superstition. For example, to cure impotence, a man might be advised to carry the dried testicles of a badger, or to consume a potion made from the blood of a freshly killed rooster. For women struggling with uterine issues, remedies might involve fumigating the vagina with strong-smelling herbs, or even applying poultices made from animal dung. These practices, while medically unsound and often dangerous, were rooted in a desperate desire for well-being and a belief in the inherent magical properties of certain substances, especially those connected to vitality and fertility. One particularly disturbing belief revolved around the idea of witches' marks and the sexual acts allegedly performed with demons. During the witch hunts, which intensified in the later Middle Ages and early modern period, accused witches were often subjected to invasive examinations to find these marks, a mole, a scar, or any unusual blemish on the body, which were believed to be places where the devil had touched them or where their familiar spirits fed. Furthermore, confessions of witches, often extracted under torture, frequently included lurid details of sexual intercourse with the devil or his imps. These confessions, though coerced and almost certainly fabricated, reflected the deep-seated anxieties and sexual repression of the age. They painted a picture of perverse, anti-Christian sexuality, where witches engaged in acts of unnatural sex in defiance of God, further cementing the Church's condemnation of any non-procreative or non-marital sexual behavior. These were not just accusations of heresy. They were accusations of profound sexual deviance, a perversion of the body and soul that was considered the ultimate sin. Let us return to Alara, standing before Morwen, the wise woman's words echoing in her mind. The idea of securing Gareth's love, of banishing the distance that had grown between them, was a powerful lure. The thought of a child, of finally fulfilling her purpose, was a beacon in her despair. She rationalized it to herself. It was not to harm Gareth, but to help him, to help them both, to restore their happiness. It was a means to an end, a small sin for a greater good. This self-deception, this desperate bargaining with her own conscience, was perhaps the most painful part of her journey. That night, Alara moved with a quiet, almost phantom-like grace. Gareth was deep in sleep, his breathing even and heavy. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the stillness of the cottage. With trembling hands, she carefully cut a small lock of his dark hair as he slept, its strands soft and warm against her fingers. She found a discarded piece of his tunic, imbued with the faint scent of his labor and his skin. And then, the most difficult part. With a needle she used for mending, she pricked his finger, so lightly that he barely stirred, drawing a single, minuscule drop of blood, barely visible in the dim light. Her stomach churned with guilt and fear, but she pushed it down, focusing on the desired outcome. She took the stolen pieces to Morwen's cottage the next day, her face pale, her eyes wide and haunted. Morwen, with her usual impassive demeanor, took the items and, with deft, practiced movements, wove them into a tight, intricate knot, humming a low, tuneless melody as she worked. She added dried rose petals, a sliver of hazelwood, and a tiny, almost imperceptible feather from a dove. "Place this beneath his pillow," Morwen instructed, her voice a low murmur. "And each night, as you lie beside him, whisper his name and speak your desire for his unwavering heart. Speak of the child you will bear him, the family you will build. Let your intent flow into the knot, binding him to you." Alara returned home, the small, woven charm clutched in her hand. It felt both fragile and immensely powerful. That night, she slid it beneath Gareth's pillow, her heart a tangled mess of hope, fear, and profound guilt. As she lay beside him, she whispered the words Morwen had taught her, her voice barely audible above the quiet creaks of the cottage. She imagined her love, her longing, her very essence, flowing into the charm, into Gareth, binding him, to her forever. This was not a prayer to God. It was an invocation to something older, something wilder, something that promised control, where the church offered only submission. The act itself was a violation of trust, a desecration of their marital intimacy. Yet in her desperate mind, it was also an act of love, a desperate attempt to save what she feared was crumbling. But this was not the most shocking revelation of the era, for the desperate search for love and fertility could often bleed into truly horrifying territory. The medieval mind, grappling with the mysteries of life and death, sometimes believed that the dead held a special power over the living. This belief manifested in an array of macabre practices, particularly concerning the use of human remains for magical purposes. Grave dirt, for instance, was considered potent for various spells, including those for love or fertility. It was believed to connect the living to the ancient powers of the earth and the spirits of the departed. More disturbingly, whispers and accusations, particularly during witch trials, sometimes mentioned the use of human body parts in rituals. This was rarely widespread practice, but the very notion of it speaks to the profound desperation and the blurred lines between life, death, and magic in the medieval imagination. The fear of witches, those who were believed to consort with demons and practice dark magic, was another significant driver of bizarre practices and beliefs surrounding sexuality. Witches were often accused of causing impotence in men and barrenness in women, of binding a couple so they could not conceive. This belief led to desperate attempts to counteract such curses. A man who found himself unable to perform his marital duties might suspect a witch's curse and seek out a counterspell. These counterspells could involve equally strange and often dangerous rituals, such as stripping naked in a graveyard at midnight, or consuming concoctions made from a variety of dubious ingredients. The psychological impact of such a belief was devastating. Not only was a man shamed by his inability to procreate, but he also lived in terror of an unseen enemy, a witch who had cursed him, and against whom he felt utterly powerless. The church, in its efforts to define and control sexuality, also grappled with the concept of same-sex relations. While unequivocally condemned as the gravest form of sodomy, the existence of such relationships, however suppressed, was a reality. The very language used to condemn it in penitential manuals and sermons reveals a profound horror and a desperate need to eradicate it from society. Yet even in this intensely repressive environment, there were subcultures, hidden pockets where such desires found expression, albeit at immense personal risk. The bizarreness here lies not in the acts themselves, but in the extreme societal and religious condemnation, which forced individuals into deep secrecy, often leading to lives of profound internal conflict, fear, and the constant threat of exposure and brutal punishment. The sheer weight of this societal repression, the absolute denial of a fundamental aspect of human identity for some, is perhaps one of the most tortured aspects of medieval sexual history. Ilara continued her secret rituals for weeks, then months. She continued to pray at church, to confess her minor sins, to live the outward life of a devout Christian woman. But inwardly, she was a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. The strange herbs, the effigy, the stolen lock of hair and drop of blood, these had become her secret confidants, her forbidden hopes. She studied Gareth with an almost painful intensity, searching for signs that the charm was working. Had his gaze lingered on her a moment longer? Had his touch been more tender, more possessive? She clung to every flicker of affection, every shared smile, convinced it was the magic taking hold. Then, one crisp autumn morning, a new feeling stirred within her, a subtle shift in her body, a faint dizziness that was not unpleasant. A week later, a missed moon cycle. And then, the undeniable certainty that often comes to women before any other sign. A child was growing within her. The joy that flooded Alara was overwhelming, a torrent of relief and gratitude that washed away months of despair. She wept, not just from happiness, but from a profound sense of vindication. The rituals had worked. Morwen's magic had broken the curse of barrenness. She rushed to Gareth, her face alight with a radiance he hadn't seen in years, and whispered the news. Gareth's reaction was a mixture of stunned disbelief and soaring joy. He lifted her, spinning her around, his laughter filling the small cottage, a sound that had been absent for too long. He thanked God, praising divine mercy, oblivious to the other, darker forces Alara believed had intervened. But Alara's joy was not pure. Beneath the surface, a chilling dread began to take root. She had conceived, yes, but at what cost? Had she traded her soul for this child? Was this a blessed gift from God, or a bargain struck with something far more ancient and dangerous? The knowledge of her secret rituals, the effigy still hidden beneath her bed, the charm beneath Gareth's pillow, became heavy burdens. She looked at her swelling belly, at the life growing within her, and wondered, was this child truly hers, truly Gareth's, or was it somehow touched by the forbidden magic, marked by her transgression? The answer, she knew, would haunt her for the rest of her days. The climax of Alara's story, while personal, connects to a universal thesis about the human condition in the face of overwhelming societal and religious pressure. Her desperation for a child, for a recognized place within her community, pushed her beyond the sanctioned boundaries of her faith, into the realm of the forbidden. She sought control where there was none, agency where she felt powerless. Her story is a poignant testament to the profound human need for connection, for purpose, and for family, a need so primal that it can drive individuals to extraordinary, and sometimes terrifying, lengths. Her pregnancy progressed, marked by the usual aches and discomforts, but also by a quiet, gnawing anxiety within Alara. She continued to attend Mass, to pray, to confess, but her heart was never truly at peace. The whispers of Morwen's incantations, the memory of the strange odors of her cottage, the feel of the crude effigy, all lingered in the recesses of her mind, casting a shadow over her burgeoning joy. She looked at Gareth, so blissfully happy, so utterly unaware of the spiritual tightrope she had walked, and felt a profound, almost suffocating loneliness. The secret was hers alone, a heavy burden that isolated her even in the midst of their shared happiness. One evening, as Alara sat by the fire, knitting a tiny garment for the coming child, Gareth, in a rare moment of introspection, spoke. "It is a miracle, is it not, Alara?" he murmured, stroking her belly gently. "God's mercy is boundless." Alara simply nodded, unable to articulate the complex tangle of emotions within her. She wanted to believe it was a miracle, a divine gift, but the shadow of her secret acts clung to her. Was this child truly blessed, or was it a product of a forbidden bargain? This question, the ultimate why of her actions, would become her constant companion. The story of Alara, and countless others like her across the medieval landscape, serves as a powerful reminder of the enduring human struggle to reconcile our deepest desires with the moral and social constructs of our time. The bizarre sexual practices of the Middle Ages, from fertility effigies and love potions to the fear of demons and the condemnation of unnatural acts, were not merely curiosities of a distant past. They were direct consequences of a world where faith permeated every aspect of life, where the church held immense power over the body and soul, and where the natural urges of human beings often clashed violently with rigid moral codes. These practices emerged from a profound sense of powerlessness, a desperate yearning for control over destinies often dictated by forces beyond individual command. God, nature, or the whims of powerful authorities. When the prescribed pathways of prayer and piety failed to deliver desired outcomes. A child, a loving spouse, protection from disease. People, in their desperation, turned to alternative, often forbidden methods. They sought agency in the shadows, comfort in ancient superstitions, and hope in rituals that promised to bend reality to their will. The human cost of this era was immense. Lives were lived under a constant cloud of fear. Fear of sin, fear of damnation, fear of demonic influence, fear of social ostracism. Intimacy, meant to be a source of connection and joy, became fraught with anxiety and guilt. For many, the very act of being human, with all its inherent desires and complexities, was a constant struggle against a pervasive sense of inadequacy and sinfulness. In the end, Ilara's child was born, a healthy, robust boy, with Gareth's dark hair and Ilara's quiet, observant eyes. The village rejoiced, and Father Michael offered fervent prayers of thanksgiving. Ilara held her son, a profound love swelling in her heart, but also a lingering, unshakable question. Was this a divine blessing, or a testament to the power of forbidden magic? She would never know for certain, and the ambiguity would be her lifelong penance. Her journey, marked by desperation and transgression, highlights a timeless truth. When faced with overwhelming pressures and unfulfilled desires, humanity will always seek ways, however unconventional or forbidden, to shape their own destinies, often at a profound personal and spiritual cost. The tortured history of human sexuality, then, is not just a tale of strange practices, but a poignant narrative of resilience, desperation, and the enduring, often heartbreaking, search for meaning and fulfillment in a world that rarely offers easy answers. And so, Ilara lived out her days, her son growing strong and healthy, a living testament to her fervent, desperate will. She watched him play in the village square, his laughter echoing across the fields, and a profound, aching love filled her heart. Yet the question, like a persistent ember, never truly died within her. Was his vibrant life a gift from the Almighty, a testament to her prayers finally answered, or was it the fruit of a forbidden seed, a quiet triumph of ancient, primal forces she had dared to invoke? The answer remained elusive, a silent, unshakable penance that shadowed her deepest joys. Her life, outwardly pious and blessed, was forever marked by that secret chamber, by the scent of strange herbs and the whisper of forbidden words. Her story, a single thread in the vast, complex tapestry of the medieval world, ultimately reveals a truth that transcends time and dogma, that the human heart, when confronted with the vast, often indifferent forces of existence, be it the silence of God, the cruelty of fate, or the crushing weight of societal expectation, will always, in its profound desperation, seek a path, any path, to fulfill its most fundamental longings, even if that journey leads into the deepest shadows, leaving behind a legacy of choices forever etched with the bittersweet taste of hope and profound, enduring mystery.